Between 1608 and 1648, large parts of Central Europe were devastated by prolonged war. Entire regions were repeatedly occupied by armies. Towns were damaged or abandoned. Rural populations declined sharply through hunger, disease, and displacement. In some areas, recovery took generations. The conflict involved most of the major powers of Europe and spread across multiple fronts. It lasted far longer than those who began it expected it to, and it reshaped how war was fought, funded, and sustained. For the people who lived through it, the war became a condition rather than an event. This video examines how the 30 Years' War unfolded, how it expanded beyond its original causes, and how societies were affected. Europe did not enter the 17th century in a state of collapse. On the surface, much of it appeared settled. Fields were cultivated according to familiar rhythms. Town councils met, markets opened, taxes were collected, sermons were preached. Generations had lived through uncertainty before, and most people understood hardship as something local and temporary. Life continued because it had always continued. The great religious upheavals of the previous century had not disappeared, but they had been contained, at least in form. After decades of open conflict, Europe had learned to live with division. Boundaries were drawn, compromises written into law, and confessional identities fixed to territory. A ruler's faith often determined that of his subjects, not because belief was uniform, but because order required clarity. The violence of earlier wars had taught elites that endless religious struggle threatened their own authority. Peace, however, did not mean trust. It meant management. Differences were tolerated so long as they remained predictable. Communities learned which churches they could attend, which holidays they could observe, which words could be spoken safely. Disputes were settled through courts and councils rather than arms, not because tensions had vanished, but because there were procedures to contain them. This containment was fragile, but it was real. At the center of this system stood the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that promised stability through law rather than force. It was not a unified state, but a dense web of jurisdictions, princes, bishops, imperial cities, knightly estates. Authority flowed through charters, privileges, and negotiated rights rather than direct command. The emperor ruled less by decree than by consensus, arbitration, and precedent. This complexity was often mocked, even in its own time, but it served a purpose. It allowed rival interests to coexist without constant war. Conflicts that might elsewhere have produced immediate violence were absorbed into legal argument. Lawsuits replaced sieges. Imperial courts became arenas where power was contested with documents instead of armies. For many decades, this system worked well enough to preserve peace across much of Central Europe. Yet this peace rested on assumptions that were rarely spoken aloud. It assumed that rulers would respect limits placed on them. It assumed that confessional balance, once agreed, would not be disturbed. It assumed that disputes would remain legal rather than military. Above all, it assumed that escalation could always be stopped once it began. These assumptions shaped how people behaved. Princes expanded their influence carefully, mindful of precedent. Cities guarded their privileges while avoiding open defiance. Religious minorities learned when to press their claims and when to remain quiet. The system rewarded patience and punished recklessness. It produced a culture of caution rather than confidence. For ordinary people, these high-level arrangements were distant but not irrelevant. The confessional settlement determined which church stood at the center of the town, which holidays were observed, which schools taught the children. It shaped marriage, inheritance, and community life. Most people adapted to these arrangements without enthusiasm, but also without resistance. Stability mattered more than conviction. Rural life followed older patterns. Peasants worked land they did not own, owing labor, rent, or dues to local lords. Harvests were uncertain, but famine was not constant. Villages endured through cooperation and custom. Local disputes were resolved within the community or brought before a magistrate. Violence existed, but it was contained, familiar, and limited. Urban centers grew slowly. Trade routes connected regions, moving grain, timber, metal, and cloth. Guilds regulated labor. Town walls still mattered, but more as symbols than necessities. The memory of sieges lingered from earlier conflicts, yet most towns had not seen sustained warfare in years. They prepared for it in theory, not in expectation. Across Europe, rulers were preoccupied with administration rather than mobilization. They raised taxes, reformed courts, codified laws. Standing armies existed, but they were small and expensive. War was understood as something exceptional, to be declared, fought, and concluded within a defined period. Few imagined a conflict that would outlive the men who began it. Religion remained the language through which many disputes were expressed, but it was no longer the sole driver of action. Confessional identity had hardened into something territorial and bureaucratic. Churches were institutions as much as spiritual communities. Faith was regulated, supervised, and enforced by law. This reduced spontaneous violence. But it also tied belief more tightly to political authority. The result was a Europe that appeared orderly while carrying unresolved tensions beneath the surface. Legal settlements had frozen divisions rather than healed them. Confessional boundaries marked territory, but did not erase resentment. Political compromise prevented open conflict, but left many dissatisfied. Stability depended on restraint, and restraint depended on continued confidence in the system. That confidence was strongest among elites. Princes and councillors believed in their ability to manage crises because they had done so before. They trusted in negotiation, arbitration, and limited force. When disputes arose, they expected them to follow familiar paths. They did not imagine that a local conflict could unravel the entire structure. This belief shaped their reactions to early signs of trouble. Small violations of confessional agreements were tolerated or contested through legal means. Diplomatic protests were exchanged. Imperial courts issued rulings that were obeyed unevenly but rarely challenged outright. Each incident was treated as an exception, not a warning. Ordinary people shared a different kind of confidence. They trusted routine. Seasons came and went. Authority figures remained in place. Taxes were collected, but life went on. Few peasants or townspeople had reason to think that the world they knew was about to disappear. Hardship was expected, catastrophe was not. Europe in 1600 was therefore not a powder keg waiting for a spark. It was a structure under strain, reinforced by habit, law, and memory. Its strength lay in its ability to absorb conflict without collapsing. Its weakness lay in the same quality. When pressure exceeded what law and custom could contain, there were few mechanisms left to stop escalation. The system had never been tested by a conflict that refused to end. It had never faced armies that lived permanently off the land, or alliances that spanned the continent, or a generation raised entirely within war. These possibilities were not imagined because they had not yet occurred. For now, Europe remained confident in its arrangements. Disputes were argued, not fought. Faith was regulated, not contested with arms. Authority was negotiated, not seized. The routines of daily life continued, steady and familiar, even as the foundations beneath them grew increasingly rigid. This was not a continent waiting for destruction. It was a continent convinced that destruction could be avoided. That conviction would not survive the decades to come. Bohemia did not appear to be the place where a continental war would begin. It was prosperous by regional standards, religiously mixed, and accustomed to compromise. For decades, its political life had been shaped by negotiated coexistence rather than open confrontation. Tension existed, but it was familiar tension, managed through estates, charters, and legal guarantees. The Bohemian crown lands sat within the wider framework of the Holy Roman Empire, bound by imperial law but marked by their own traditions. Religious diversity had long been a fact of life. Utraquists, Lutherans, and Catholics lived alongside one another under arrangements that were imperfect but workable. These compromises did not eliminate resentment, but they reduced the likelihood of immediate violence. What unsettled this balance was not a single decree or personality, but a gradual tightening of authority. Imperial officials sought greater uniformity in governance and worship, believing that clarity would prevent disorder. Local elites, accustomed to autonomy, interpreted these moves as encroachment. Each side believed it was acting defensively. The dispute that followed unfolded through familiar channels. Petitions were written. Legal arguments were prepared. Appeals were made to precedent and privilege. Both sides expected the matter to remain contained within established procedures. There was no widespread sense that events were slipping beyond control. When representatives of the Bohemian estates confronted imperial officials in Prague in 1608, the meeting itself was unremarkable in form. Such confrontations had occurred before. What followed, however, broke with custom. The officials were seized and thrown from a castle window, tumbling into the ditch below. The act was violent, but it was not designed to kill. It was a gesture, meant to signal defiance rather than to initiate war. Those involved understood it as a dramatic assertion of rights, a way to force negotiation by breaking protocol. The men survived the fall, reinforcing the sense that this was symbolic rather than final. News of the incident traveled quickly, but its meaning remained uncertain. In Prague, the act was framed as a justified response to illegal overreach. In Vienna, it was interpreted as rebellion. Elsewhere, it was read through local concerns and ambitions. No single interpretation dominated. Crucially, few believed that escalation was inevitable. The Holy Roman Empire had mechanisms for resolving disputes between rulers and estates. Rebellions had been contained before. Sanctions, negotiations, and limited force were all available options. The prevailing assumption was that the system would absorb the shock. Early responses reflected this confidence. Imperial authorities moved cautiously, weighing legal and political consequences. Bohemian leaders organized defensively, careful not to provoke immediate retaliation. Foreign powers observed rather than intervened, treating the situation as a regional disturbance rather than a continental crisis. Language mattered. Both sides framed their actions in legal terms, invoking rights, privileges, and obligations rather than holy war or conquest. Even as positions hardened, the dispute remained, in their minds, negotiable. Violence was a tool of leverage, not an end in itself. This misreading was shared widely. Princes across the empire watched events unfold without urgency. Some sympathized with the Bohemian estates, others with the emperor. Most assumed that the conflict would follow familiar patterns: protest, suppression, settlement. What they underestimated was the way precedent operated under strain. The defiance in Prague did more than challenge authority in Bohemia. It signaled that legal mechanisms could be bypassed when they failed to deliver desired outcomes. This lesson did not go unnoticed. As Bohemia moved toward open resistance, alliances formed along lines that felt provisional rather than permanent. Support was extended cautiously. Commitments were hedged. No one wished to be drawn too deeply into a conflict that might soon resolve itself. Yet each step taken to protect interests narrowed the space for retreat. Measures adopted as temporary became difficult to reverse. Mobilization, once begun, created its own momentum. Armies assembled for deterrence could not easily be disbanded without loss of face or security. Diplomacy continued, but it lagged behind events. Messages took weeks to travel. Decisions were made with incomplete information. By the time responses arrived, circumstances had already shifted. Misunderstanding compounded miscalculation. Religious language grew sharper, not because beliefs had suddenly intensified, but because it provided a vocabulary for mobilization. Faith offered clarity in a situation that was becoming uncertain. It simplified choices that were, in reality, deeply political and strategic. Still, there was no sense that Europe stood at the edge of catastrophe. The conflict remained geographically limited. Its causes appeared specific. Its participants believed themselves capable of managing outcomes. What changed was not intention, but scale. Each intervention widened the circle of those invested in the outcome. Each attempt to secure advantage made neutrality harder to maintain. The dispute began to exceed the structures designed to contain it. By the time the first major campaigns were underway, the original grievances were already being reframed. What had begun as a defense of privileges was becoming a struggle over authority. What had been a local assertion of rights was turning into a test of imperial order. This shift was subtle, almost administrative. There was no single moment when the conflict transformed into something larger. It happened through accumulation, decisions made under pressure, assumptions carried forward, options foreclosed one by one. Europe did not stumble into war blindly. It walked into it believing the path was still reversible. By the end of 1608, that belief was becoming harder to sustain. As the conflict widened beyond Bohemia, the language used to describe it remained familiar. Declarations spoke of faith, loyalty, and the defense of rightful order. Sermons framed events as trials sent by God. Pamphlets warned of heresy or tyranny, depending on their audience. Religion continued to supply meaning, but it no longer determined behavior on its own. What began to change was the way war was organized. Armies expanded beyond the personal households of princes and the temporary levies of earlier decades. Sustained conflict required men who could be assembled quickly, moved across long distances, and kept under arms for years rather than months. This could not be achieved through obligation alone. Soldiers were recruited through contracts. Captains promised pay, food, and the prospect of advancement. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it was negotiated. Men fought for causes they scarcely understood under banners that changed as often as their employers. Faith might shape identity, but survival shaped decisions. Maintaining these forces required systems that reached far beyond the battlefield. Supplies had to be gathered, stored, and transported. Wages had to be calculated and distributed. Discipline had to be enforced through regulation rather than personal allegiance. War became an administrative problem as much as a moral one. These demands altered the relationship between rulers and violence. Decisions once made on the assumption of short campaigns now carried long-term consequences. Raising an army meant committing resources indefinitely. Disbanding it risked disorder, unpaid soldiers, and unrest. Every mobilization narrowed future choices. Religious justification remained useful because it simplified explanation. It allowed rulers to present complex political calculations as matters of conscience. It helped persuade subjects to accept taxation and hardship. Yet behind this language lay a growing awareness that belief alone could not sustain armies in the field. Mercenary culture flourished within this environment. Experienced soldiers moved from one employer to another, carrying skills that were increasingly professional. They understood formations, logistics, and command structures better than many of the men who hired them. Their loyalty was conditional, shaped by pay and opportunity rather than confession. This did not mean that religion ceased to matter. It continued to influence trust, suspicion, and propaganda. Units were often organized along confessional lines, and atrocities could still be framed as punishment or purification. But belief now operated within a system driven by contracts and necessity. As armies grew, so did their appetite. Supplying tens of thousands of men across regions with limited infrastructure proved impossible through planning alone. Commanders relied on requisition, contribution, and coercion. What could not be purchased was taken. What could not be taken was destroyed. This practice was not always the result of cruelty or indiscipline. It was often the product of arithmetic. Pay arrived late or not at all. Supply trains were inadequate. Local resources became the only means of keeping armies intact. Violence followed from logistical failure rather than ideological zeal. Responsibility for this violence was diffuse. Orders passed through layers of command. Decisions made in distant councils translated into suffering on the ground without direct intention. Rulers authorized campaigns. Commanders enforced discipline imperfectly. Soldiers acted within conditions they did not control. No single figure directed the cumulative destruction. Administrative distance allowed moral distance. Those who planned the war rarely witnessed its effects. Reports reduced devastation to figures and summaries. Losses were measured in men and money, not in emptied villages or broken communities. This abstraction made continuation easier. The longer the war lasted, the more these systems hardened. Temporary measures became standard practice. Extraordinary taxation became routine. Military administration expanded to meet ongoing demands. War ceased to be an interruption of normal governance and became part of it. For those caught between armies, the shift was unmistakable. Earlier conflicts had passed through regions and moved on. Now forces lingered, returned, and overlapped. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred as entire populations were drawn into the mechanics of supply and survival. Religious identity offered little protection. A village's confession mattered less than its location and resources. Allegiance shifted with circumstance. Cooperation became a strategy for endurance rather than a statement of belief. People adapted as best they could to pressures imposed from above. The language of faith persisted because it was familiar and compelling, but it increasingly concealed rather than explained reality. War continued, not because conviction deepened, but because structures had been built that depended on its continuation. By this stage, the conflict no longer required a clear cause to persist. Armies needed employment, administrations needed revenue, alliances needed justification. Each depended on the others to function. What had begun as a series of disputes framed in religious terms was now sustained by mechanisms that operated independently of belief. The war endured because it had become organized, funded, and managed in ways that made stopping it more difficult than continuing. Faith remained present, spoken and contested, but it was no longer sufficient to explain what was happening. The machinery of war had taken on a life of its own, carrying Europe further into a conflict that could not easily be undone. As the war widened, it did not spread evenly. It settled. Central Europe, and the German lands in particular, became a place where armies arrived and did not leave. Geography, politics, and infrastructure combined to turn the region into a corridor through which forces passed again and again, each time stripping more from the same ground. The imperial territories sat between competing powers, crossed by roads that linked north and south, east and west. Control of these routes mattered, but holding them required constant presence. Garrisons were installed in towns that had never expected to host soldiers for long. What began as temporary accommodation hardened into occupation. For civilians, this shift altered the meaning of war. Earlier conflicts had moved through regions like storms, violent but brief. Now the presence of soldiers became a condition of daily life. Troops quartered in homes, barns, and churches. Fields were trampled before harvest. Livestock was seized or slaughtered. Each army insisted it was only passing through. Few ever truly did. Occupation did not depend on allegiance. Towns that submitted were burdened almost as heavily as those that resisted. Contribution lists were drawn up, demanding food, money, and labor. Failure to meet these demands invited punishment, but compliance offered no lasting protection. Another army would arrive soon enough. Fear became constant rather than episodic. Villagers learned to listen for distant sounds, to read signs of approaching forces, to hide what little they had left. Families scattered when troops appeared, retreating into forests or hills. Some returned when the soldiers moved on. Others did not. Repeated occupation wore down social bonds. Communities argued over how to respond, whether to resist, comply, or flee. Decisions made under pressure bred resentment. Survival often depended on cooperation with those inflicting harm, a compromise that left lasting scars. The burden of sustaining armies fell unevenly. Regions already stripped bare could offer little, forcing soldiers to extract more aggressively from what remained. This cycle intensified destruction. Hunger spread not only because crops failed, but because there was nothing left to harvest. Disease followed closely. Crowded quarters, poor sanitation, and constant movement created ideal conditions for illness. Plague, typhus, and dysentery moved faster than any army. Entire villages were emptied without a single battle being fought. The violence that accompanied this process was rarely ordered directly. It emerged from conditions. Soldiers unpaid or underfed took what they needed. Discipline weakened as commanders struggled to control forces stretched thin. Acts of brutality became common enough to lose their shock. One event, however, cut through this grim routine and reshaped how the war was understood. In 1631, the city of Magdeburg was taken by imperial forces after a prolonged siege. What followed was not unusual in its elements, but unprecedented in its scale and visibility. When the city fell, order collapsed. Fires spread through densely built streets. Soldiers killed indiscriminately, looting homes and churches alike. Thousands of civilians died in a matter of hours. Much of the city was destroyed, its population scattered or erased. News of Magdeburg traveled quickly and lingered. The sack became a reference point, a warning of what could happen when control failed. It was invoked to justify resistance and to enforce submission. Fear of similar destruction shaped decisions across the region. Magdeburg mattered not because it was unique, but because it was undeniable. It stripped away lingering assumptions that restraint would prevail. Neutrality, long seen as a viable strategy, lost credibility. If a major city could be annihilated, no community could rely on its status or obedience for safety. After this, responses hardened. Towns fortified themselves where they could. Others surrendered preemptively. Some were abandoned altogether. The landscape began to change as people adapted to prolonged danger. Armies, too, adapted. Commanders used terror deliberately, aware of its psychological power. The threat of destruction became a negotiating tool. Violence no longer required immediate military justification. Its reputation was enough. The war now fed directly on the civilian world. Production, trade, and local governance collapsed under sustained pressure. Markets emptied. Roads became unsafe. Authority fragmented as officials fled or were killed. Children grew up amid this instability, knowing little else. Memory of peace faded. What remained was a pattern of movement and extraction that felt permanent. For rulers far from the fighting, Reports reduced this devastation to numbers and summaries. Losses were recorded, territories marked as contested or secured. The human cost was absorbed into administrative language that allowed decisions to continue as planned. Central Europe ceased to be merely a theatre of war. It became its engine. Armies survived by consuming the same regions repeatedly, drawing sustenance from destruction itself. By this stage, the idea of standing aside had lost meaning. Neutrality no longer protected, it invited suspicion. Survival required alignment, yet alignment offered no guarantee. Communities were forced into choices that carried risk regardless of outcome. The war had stopped moving. It had settled into the land. And once settled, it began to hollow it out. For a time, the war had remained a struggle contained within the structures of the empire. It was destructive, but its center of gravity still lay in disputes over authority and order within Central Europe. That balance did not survive the entry of foreign powers. When kings intervened, they did so not to restore peace, but to secure advantage. Sweden's decision to enter the conflict was framed as a defense of faith and stability in the north. Its armies arrived with discipline, organization, and a reputation for restraint. Compared to the roaming forces that had devastated the German lands, they appeared almost orderly. For some communities, their arrival brought a brief sense of relief. This hope was fragile. Swedish intervention did not simplify the war, it multiplied its dimensions. New fronts opened. Existing alliances shifted. What had been a largely imperial conflict now drew in states with interests that extended far beyond Germany. Each pursued security through expansion, convinced that withdrawal would leave them exposed. The language surrounding these interventions remained confident. Victories were presented as turning points. Defeats were explained as temporary setbacks. There was a persistent belief that decisive action by capable rulers could impose order on the chaos that had spread across Central Europe. Yet the presence of powerful monarchies altered the scale of the war in ways that made resolution more difficult. Larger armies required greater resources. Campaigns stretched across wider territories. Coordination between allies became complex and unreliable. Each success created new obligations and expectations. Religion continued to shape rhetoric, but alliances increasingly ignored confessional boundaries. Catholic and Protestant powers supported one another when it served strategic interests. Faith offered legitimacy, but it no longer determined partnership. Survival and influence mattered more than consistency. For civilians, these shifts brought little improvement. Armies that arrived with promises of protection soon faced the same constraints as their predecessors. Supply lines faltered. Pay fell behind. Local populations were once again expected to bear the burden. The pattern of extraction continued, now intensified by the presence of larger forces. Temporary victories raised expectations that could not be sustained. When armies advanced, communities hoped the war might move elsewhere. When they retreated, fear returned, often compounded by reprisals. The front lines shifted repeatedly, but the pressure remained. As foreign powers committed more deeply, the cost of withdrawal rose. Rulers feared that abandoning the conflict would embolden rivals and weaken their own authority. Peace came to be seen not as relief, but as risk. The war persisted because stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. The administrative machinery described earlier expanded to meet these demands. Taxation increased. Credit was strained. Governments borrowed against uncertain futures to sustain armies in the present. War planning became inseparable from state finance. Decisions were made far from the areas most affected. Councils debated strategy, while villages disappeared from maps. Reports filtered upward, stripped of detail. The suffering of civilians was acknowledged abstractly, but rarely allowed to shape policy. Each intervention justified the next. As one power gained ground, others moved to counterbalance it. The conflict grew outward, drawing in regions that had previously remained peripheral. What had once seemed a local crisis became a continental contest. Despite this expansion, clarity remained elusive. No single objective united the participants. Goals shifted as circumstances changed. Victories failed to produce closure. Defeats did not compel retreat. The war continued through momentum rather than direction. For soldiers, this meant longer service and greater uncertainty. For civilians, it meant the continuation of hardship without prospect of relief. For rulers, it meant deeper entanglement in a conflict that resisted control. By this stage, the war no longer appeared solvable through force alone. Yet force remained the primary tool employed. Diplomacy existed alongside fighting, but it struggled to keep pace with events on the ground. Agreements reached in principle were undermined by new developments before they could take effect. The entry of kings had promised resolution through authority and power. Instead, it ensured that the conflict would outgrow any single ruler's ability to end it. The war had become too large to conclude cleanly, too complex to reverse, and too costly to abandon. Its endpoint receded with every attempt to bring it closer. For much of the war's early years, civilians clung to the belief that armies were temporary visitors. Soldiers arrived, took what they needed, and moved on. This expectation shaped how people responded. They hid valuables, sent children away, endured short-term hardship in the hope that normal life would soon return. By the middle of the conflict, that belief could no longer be sustained. Armies did not pass through, they remained. Garrisons settled into towns for months or years at a time. Troops returned to the same villages season after season. What had once been disruption became condition. This permanence altered everything. Fields left unplanted one year were still barren the next. Livestock seized once could not be replaced. Tools were lost, homes damaged, labor interrupted. Recovery required time that no longer existed. Hunger spread gradually, unevenly. At first it appeared as scarcity, then as dependence. Families sold possessions to buy food, then traded tools, then land. When nothing remained to exchange, they borrowed. When credit ran out, they fled or starved. Disease followed closely behind deprivation. Crowded quarters, weakened bodies, and constant movement created ideal conditions for illness. Plague returned to places that had not seen it in generations. Fever and dysentery moved through camps and villages alike. Death became familiar, expected rather than shocking. Displacement became widespread. People abandoned homes that could no longer sustain them, moving toward towns or safer regions. Many found nothing there but competition and suspicion. Refugees strained communities already under pressure, eroding bonds that had once provided support. Trust within villages began to fray. Decisions about cooperation with occupying forces divided neighbors. Some complied to protect their families. Others resisted, inviting retaliation that affected everyone. Accusations spread. Old grievances resurfaced under new stress. Local authority weakened. Officials who remained in place lacked the power to protect those they governed. Others fled, leaving communities to manage themselves. Informal leadership emerged, often contested and unstable. Order became fragile and local. Violence against civilians was not constant, but it was unpredictable. Its threat shaped behavior more than its frequency. Women learned to avoid certain roads and times of day. Families adjusted routines to minimize exposure. Children grew up with rules shaped by danger rather than custom. Such violence was rarely recorded in detail. It entered memory through absence rather than description. Lives altered, relationships broken, futures narrowed. These experiences accumulated quietly, without leaving clear traces in official records. Religious institutions, once centers of stability, struggled to provide refuge. Churches were looted, repurposed, or destroyed. Clergy faced the same pressures as their congregations. Faith offered solace to some, but it could not guarantee safety or sustenance. Over time, emotional responses shifted. Fear gave way to calculation. People learned when to flee and when to stay, whom to trust and whom to avoid. Adaptation became a skill, passed through observation rather than instruction. Children absorbed this reality early. Many knew no other world. Their memories formed around movement, hunger, and loss. Education was interrupted or abandoned. Skills that once promised advancement became irrelevant to survival. The presence of armies reshaped moral boundaries. Acts that would once have been unthinkable became necessary. Theft, deception, and silence were tools of endurance. Judgment softened as circumstances hardened. For some, service to armies offered a way out. Young men joined military units not out of conviction, but because it promised food and protection. This choice further blurred the line between civilian and soldier, drawing entire communities into the machinery of war. As years passed, the idea of peace became abstract. It was spoken of, hoped for, but difficult to imagine in concrete terms. Few remembered what stability felt like. The future shrank to the next harvest, the next winter, the next passing army. Belief systems adapted under this pressure. Faith remained present, but it was often private and quiet. Public expressions carried risk. Loyalty to rulers or causes faded as their ability to offer protection diminished. Survival replaced allegiance as the primary concern. Decisions were made based on immediate need rather than principle. This was not a rejection of belief, but a response to conditions that left little room for it. The war's impact on civilians did not announce itself with single moments of catastrophe. It unfolded through accumulation, one loss added to another, one compromise following the next. By the time its full weight was felt, there was little energy left to resist it. What remained was endurance. People adjusted to the presence of danger, hunger, and uncertainty as facts of life. The war no longer shocked them. It simply continued, and they continued within it. By the mid-1630s, the war had lost its urgency. It no longer announced itself through dramatic beginnings or decisive campaigns. It persisted through habit. Fighting continued because it had been continuing for years, and no one involved could see a safe way to stop. The causes that had once been argued so carefully faded from memory. Bohemia, confessional rights, imperial authority. These remained part of official language, but they no longer explained daily decisions. For those living within the war, it had become a constant condition rather than a contested issue. Armies still moved across the land, but with less coherence. Units broke apart, reassembled, and changed employers. Command structures weakened as experienced officers died or left service. What remained were forces that survived by movement and extraction rather than by clear objectives. These roaming armies were dangerous, not because they were large or disciplined, but because they were desperate. Pay was irregular. Supply systems were exhausted. Soldiers relied increasingly on what they could take directly. Violence became smaller in scale, but more frequent, woven into daily life. For civilians, this phase of the war was marked less by sudden catastrophe than by steady decline. There were fewer dramatic sacks, fewer moments that entered chronicles. Instead, there was absence. Empty houses, untended fields, roads that led nowhere. Communities that had survived earlier devastation struggled to rebuild. Any sign of recovery attracted renewed attention from passing troops. Growth became a liability. Prosperity, even modest, invited extraction. Many learned to remain invisible, suppressing activity to avoid notice. States faced their own form of exhaustion. Treasuries were drained. Credit was stretched thin. Rulers borrowed against future revenues that might never materialize. Administrative systems expanded to manage scarcity, not abundance. Despite this strain, peace remained elusive. Ending the war carried risks that leaders feared more than continuation. Demobilizing armies threatened unrest. Conceding territory weakened authority. Accepting compromise invited rivals to press further demands. Negotiations occurred repeatedly, but they rarely altered conditions on the ground. Talks were delayed by distance, interrupted by new campaigns, or undermined by shifting alliances. Each party waited for exhaustion to break the other first. This waiting became its own strategy. Victory was no longer expected through decisive action, but through endurance. States hoped to outlast opponents financially, militarily, or socially. The war continued not because anyone believed it could be won outright, but because no one wished to lose by stopping. For those far from decision-making centers, this logic offered little comfort. The war no longer promised change, only continuation. People adjusted expectations accordingly. Plans shrank. Futures were measured in weeks rather than years. Children born during this period inherited a world already worn down. They learned trades that served survival rather than advancement. Education, where it existed, focused on practicality. Memory of peace belonged to an older generation. Religion continued to structure life, but its role shifted. It offered language for suffering and endurance rather than explanation or mobilization. Public rituals persisted, though often reduced in scale. Faith became quieter, more inward. Violence, once shocking, receded into background noise. Its presence was assumed. Its absence, when it occurred, passed without comment. This normalization marked a deeper transformation than any single battle. Administrative records from this period reflect the same dull persistence. Reports repeat familiar phrases. Losses are noted without elaboration. Requests for aid follow patterns established years earlier. The extraordinary had become routine. The land itself bore the marks of this long decay. Forests reclaimed abandoned fields. Villages disappeared from maps. Infrastructure collapsed through neglect rather than destruction. Recovery, where it occurred, was fragile and easily undone. As the 1640s progressed, the war seemed less like an event than a setting. People lived within it as they might within climate or geography. It shaped behavior without demanding constant attention. This was not a stalemate marked by tension and anticipation. It was stagnation. A slow erosion of capacity, trust, and memory. The war had not ended, but it had ceased to feel temporary. It had become the background against which life continued, diminished and uncertain. As the war dragged into its third decade, the search for peace became a parallel process rather than an alternative to fighting. Negotiations began while armies were still in the field, their outcomes uncertain and their relevance fragile. Delegations traveled slowly across a continent worn thin by years of movement and scarcity. Talks did not gather in a single place at once. They unfolded across cities, corridors, and waiting rooms. Representatives arrived with instructions shaped by fear rather than optimism. Each carried lists of demands meant to secure advantage rather than reconciliation. The assumption was not that peace would heal the damage already done, but that it might prevent further loss. The people most affected by the war were absent from these discussions. Peasants, Townspeople and displaced families were not consulted. Their suffering entered negotiations only indirectly, as numbers attached to ruined provinces or lost revenues. What mattered most were rights, borders, and precedents that could be recorded and enforced. Meanwhile, fighting continued. Armies still needed to be fed, garrisons still occupied towns. Requisitions did not pause because diplomats spoke of peace. In some regions, the violence intensified as commanders sought to improve their position before any settlement was finalized. This overlap created a sense of unreality. For civilians, the promise of peace was distant and abstract. They had heard such promises before. Negotiations had failed many times. Until soldiers departed, words carried little weight. The process itself was slow by design. Each clause required agreement among parties who trusted one another only minimally. Compromises were scrutinized for hidden risk. Progress was measured in weeks and months rather than decisive breakthroughs. When agreements were reached, they addressed structure rather than suffering. Authority was clarified. Jurisdictions were recognized. Confessional arrangements were confirmed or adjusted. These decisions mattered greatly to rulers and states, shaping how power would be exercised in the future. For those living amid ruins, their impact was less immediate. Fields did not recover because borders were redrawn. Homes did not rebuild themselves because rights were confirmed. Hunger did not recede because documents were signed. The settlement that emerged brought an end to formal hostilities between the major powers. Armies began, slowly, to withdraw or disband. Gunfire faded. Roads grew quieter. The noise that had dominated daily life for decades receded. This silence did not bring relief. It exposed absence. Places once filled with people remained empty. Churches stood without congregations. Villages existed only as names remembered by those who had fled them. Administrative tasks replaced military ones. Officials counted losses, assessed damage, and attempted to restore order. Their work was careful and limited. Resources were scarce. Expectations were low. The legal framework established by the peace created stability at the level of states. It reduced the likelihood of immediate large-scale conflict. It provided mechanisms for managing disputes that had previously led to war. At the human level, however, the settlement offered little. Trauma had no clause. Hunger had no provision. Grief was not addressed by any article. People returned to land that could no longer sustain them. Others remained displaced, unable or unwilling to go back. Communities reformed unevenly, shaped by who had survived and who had not. The war's end did not mark a return to the past. Too much had changed. Knowledge had been lost. Skills had vanished. Trust had eroded. The future would have to be built on altered ground. For many, the end of fighting passed almost unnoticed. There was no single day when peace arrived. It filtered in gradually as soldiers left and demands ceased. Even then, fear lingered. People waited to see if the quiet would last. The settlement succeeded in stopping the war. It did not attempt to repair its damage. That task fell to those who had already endured more than they could afford. Peace arrived as procedure, not restoration. The violence ended. The absence remained. When the fighting ended, there was no moment that gathered the war into memory. No single image could contain what had been lost. The 30 Years' War did not conclude with a victory to be measured or celebrated. It left behind a continent altered in ways that resisted easy description. Across large parts of Central Europe, the scale of loss became visible only slowly. Some regions had lost a third of their population, others more. Death came through battle, but more often through hunger and disease. Entire generations were thinned. Communities that had once supported themselves found they no longer could. The demographic collapse carried consequences beyond numbers. Skills disappeared with those who practiced them. Local knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next, broke off. Fields lay fallow not only because they were damaged, but because there were fewer hands to work them. Recovery, where it occurred, was uneven and fragile. Some towns rebuilt with new populations drawn from elsewhere. Others never returned. Villages vanished from records and memory alike. The landscape itself bore the imprint of absence. Germany emerged from the war profoundly fragmented. The political structure that had once absorbed conflict through law and negotiation now reflected the damage done to it. Authority remained divided among hundreds of jurisdictions, but the confidence that had sustained this arrangement was diminished. No single power emerged strong enough to impose lasting unity. Instead, fragmentation hardened. Local rulers guarded autonomy closely, wary of renewed conflict. The empire endured, but as a framework shaped by caution rather than ambition. This fragmentation affected how power was understood and exercised. States across Europe drew lessons from the war, not about justice or belief, but about control. They invested in standing armies, taxation systems, and administrative reach. Violence became something to be organized, regulated, and sustained. The war had demonstrated that prolonged conflict required more than conviction. It required infrastructure. Future wars would be planned with this knowledge in mind, even as rulers promised restraint. For ordinary people, these developments offered little reassurance. The memory of vulnerability lingered. Communities rebuilt with an awareness of how quickly stability could vanish. Trust in distant authority remained limited. Cultural life bore similar scars. Art, literature, and religious practice reflected endurance rather than triumph. Themes of suffering, patience, and uncertainty replaced earlier confidence. The war reshaped how people understood their place in the world. Belief systems adapted to this reality. Faith continued, but often with a quieter tone. Public certainty gave way to private endurance. The experience of prolonged insecurity left little room for absolutes. The meaning of war itself had changed. It was no longer imagined as a temporary disruption with a clear beginning and end. It had revealed itself as a condition that could persist for decades, shaping lives without resolving anything. Peace, when it came, did not erase this understanding. It confirmed it. The absence of fighting was welcome, but it did not restore what had been lost. Exhaustion, rather than reconciliation, defined the end. The 30 Years' War did not produce a winner. It produced survivors, many of whom carried the war forward in memory and habit. When the fighting ended, it did so unevenly. Some armies withdrew under orders that arrived late. Others dissolved before they could be formally dismissed. In many places, the presence of soldiers faded gradually, leaving behind land that had been altered beyond quick repair. Communities rebuilt where enough people remained to do so. Elsewhere, fields stayed empty and settlements were not restored. Administration resumed faster than recovery, recording losses and restoring authority without the means to reverse what had been lost. Those who survived adjusted to quieter conditions shaped by long experience. The war did not leave them with clarity or resolution, only with habits formed under pressure and expectations reduced by time. The 30 Years' War ended. Life continued on changed ground.